Okay. In 1867, of course, we know that Straits Settlements goes to the Colonial Office, and this leads to a greater effort, greater interest of the government in disease, especially the other infectious diseases like smallpox, cholera, and plague, leprosy. For some strange reason, leprosy was a big concern of the colonial government, even though much less people died of leprosy, but not TB. The British continued to ignore TB. So here we can kind of teach change and continuity. There is some change, but it's not enough. Until the beginnings of the 20th century, with this guy came from Britain to do a study on Singapore's death rates. The governor wanted him to find out why the death rate in the town was so high. So he went to these places, which this is a post-war photo, but in the beginning of the 20th century, the situation is very, very much similar. This area does not change very much over the course of the 20th century until urban renewal. Okay, and this is, of course, the Singapore River. And, the north side is the North Bridge Road area, and the south side is Chinatown. So this is where Simpson, W.J.R. Simpson, the British expert on sanitation, went to. And this is unique and important because it's probably the first time a leading medical sanitary expert went into this shop house. So he went in, and you can see here on this left side, there are these municipal inspectors who probably for the first time in their career went into these shop houses and sat across from the Chinese residents. This one also, and you can see these are very remarkable shop house cubicles. You can see much more clearly from the map actually. So like, this is the first one, yeah. Okay, so this one is Quadrant, China Street, Church Street, Telok Ayer Street, and Peking Street. Some of these roads are no longer around. So this is in Chinatown. And so what happened is, these shop houses are all built, jumbled together without any break in between them. And they are all very deep. So, when you go into the shop house, you can walk all the way back a long way, like if you walk in like that from the start to the end. And at the back, in the middle, in the back, there will be no light, no windows, totally dark. And the whole place will be divided into many shop houses. And the whole area was like this, so along the main, all these small streets, not even main streets. These are all boundaries for these shop houses. They are built without proper end. They are built back to back. So this is where the coolies lived and where they thought the death rates were the highest. So what was Simpson's finding? That tuberculosis was the reason why the death rates were high, because it was killing the men who were the coolies, single men. If you have a family, you cannot live in a shop house because there's no space for your children. So TB was the reason, and it was really a disease of town-dwelling Chinese. So he used a racial term that is a Chinese disease. It's about sanitation, it's about people living in bad housing with no light, no airflow. That's where the TB germ can kind of spread, but it's also a disease of the Chinese. Okay, so there's a mix of medical and racial thinking there. What were the reasons? So here you can kind of think about causation. What are the reasons why tuberculosis took root? Partly economic. The Chinese for a long time had a very strong resistance to living outside of the town. They want to live near the place that they work, which was the port area or the businesses and industries around the port area. And they want to live near their friends, their neighbors, people who speak the same dialect. And and people who can help them when they need help, when they need money, and where the services are. The other reason is political, right? I mean, the British didn't just control the port; they controlled the these areas. They controlled how these areas would be developed, and the fact that they were able and willing to let this happen shows a lack of commitment to controlling the urban development of the shop houses. In fact, they kind of split up all these lands into small lots and just rented it out to the developers. And then they just wash their hands off. Simpson's proposal was you need to have a break in between the shop houses. You cannot have them so deep. So like you need to make this gap, right, between the backs of the shop houses. Now this is easier said than done. This is a very nice plan, but how to do this? You have got to remove the people living in this area, and then you have got to keep this area open and free. How do you keep this area open and free? If you remove the backs of these shop houses, in a few weeks you'll be rebuilt again if you don't send your inspectors there. So this leads to a cat and mouse game of who is actually in control of the shop houses. So you can find often in medical diseases, medical history, that they often have a political and economic aspects. Now, in a way, Simpson was a terrible expert. He was a terrible advisor. He had this theory, he showed this diagram of the shop houses where there are a number of deaths happening in the certain cubicles over a number of years, right? You can see the years at the bottom, 1901, 1902, 1904, over 4 years. So, certain cubicles had a lot of deaths. So he said because of this, they are living together. That's why they had deaths like that. But actually, he's totally wrong. Right? You want to know? You want to guess why?
It doesn't explain why is it that there are certain places where you don't have that amount.
Right, exactly. It doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
If it really spreads, it would spread throughout, most of the cubicles.
Yeah.
So the people living in Singapore actually pointed this out and wrote to the newspapers telling him he's rubbish. Actually, so the cubicles with a lot of deaths were actually death houses. They were places where people were brought there to die. Yeah. So this is what happens when an expert is brought to Singapore without any knowledge of local conditions. However, Simpson had a major impact, so in terms of causality, this is important for the history of housing in Singapore. His name was brought up again and again in subsequent commissions to study housing and tuberculosis in Singapore. Until 20 years later, in 1927, we have the formation of the SIT, Singapore Improvement Trust. It was an improvement trust, not a building trust, but it began to build the first public housing in Singapore in the 1930s. After the war, it built a lot more in Tiong Bahru and in other places around the city. And of course, the HDB in the 1960s onwards began to build, the amount of housing, public housing that would break the housing problem. So in a way, the Simpson study is historically very important. And it all started with this concern about tuberculosis in the shop houses. That's where our public housing story comes from. So you can kind of trace it, from the early chapters of the textbook to the end of the textbook, the work of the HDB.